I'm the kind of guy who tips $1 max, 20% if the service was exceptional, but let's be honest. Exceptional service at a casino buffet means they remember to bring you napkins. So when I watched my wife Jackie's face light up like Christmas morning as some flashy stranger peeled off 10 hundreds for a cocktail waitress, I knew I was watching the beginning of the end of my marriage. The stranger's name was Sterling Vance, and he had the kind of confidence that comes from either having money or pretending you do. Gold watch, Italian shoes, the works. The cocktail waitress, Rosa, according to her name tag, nearly dropped her tray when he handed her that stack of bills. "For excellent service," Sterling said, loud enough for half the casino to hear. Jackie practically melted into her chair beside him. I was supposed to be at home, supposed to be watching the game and drinking beer from a can like every other Tuesday night for the past 15 years. Instead, I was crouched behind a slot machine like some discount private investigator, watching my wife of 23 years make googly eyes at a man who tipped more in 5 minutes than I made in a day. Jackie had been acting strange for weeks. Late nights at the law office where she worked as a paralegal, new clothes that cost more than our monthly grocery budget. A sudden interest in her appearance that included gym memberships and hair appointments that left our checking account lighter and her spirits mysteriously higher. "Working late again," she'd say, pecking my cheek with lips that tasted like expensive lipstick instead of the drugstore stuff she'd worn for 2 decades. The lies started small. A work dinner here, a client meeting there. But Jackie had never been good at deception, and I'd been an engineer long enough to recognize when the numbers didn't add up. The law firm she worked for specialized in personal injury cases, not the kind that required evening entertainment at casinos 40 miles from our neighborhood. So here I was, watching my wife lean into Sterling Vance like he was the most fascinating man on earth, while he regaled her with stories of his latest wins. The man had charisma, I'll give him that. The kind that made people forget to ask practical questions like where the money actually came from. Rosa pocketed the tip with shaking hands, her face flushed with embarrassment and gratitude. $1,000 was probably more than she made in 2 weeks of serving drinks to gamblers and tourists. Sterling basked in the attention, his arm draped casually around Jackie's shoulders like he owned her. My phone buzzed. A text from Jackie. "Working late tonight, don't wait up." I looked across the casino floor at her, laughing at something Sterling whispered in her ear, and felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger exactly, more like the feeling you get when you realize you've been solving the wrong equation for hours and all your work is worthless. The rational part of my brain, the part that had spent 25 years designing structural systems for buildings, started cataloging details. Sterling's watch looked expensive, but his shoes were scuffed. His suit was well tailored, but I noticed him checking his phone nervously every few minutes. And when he thought no one was looking, his confident smile slipped into something that looked more like desperation. I'd seen that look before, on the faces of contractors who'd overbid projects and were scrambling to cover their costs. The look of someone living beyond their means and hoping nobody would notice. But Jackie was noticing all the wrong things. She saw the generous tip, the flashy gesture, the performance of wealth. She didn't see what I was seeing, the subtle signs that Sterling Vance was putting on a show. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was my best friend Bob, texting from his garage where he spent most evenings tinkering with classic cars. "Beer's cold if you want to come by. Game's getting good." I almost left then. Almost walked away from the casino and pretended I'd never seen my wife with another man. But as I watched Sterling lean over to whisper something that made Jackie giggle like a teenager, I realized I couldn't unknow what I knew. Sterling excused himself to use the restroom, and I saw my chance. I needed to get closer, to hear what Jackie was telling her new friend. But as I moved between the slot machines, trying to look casual, I nearly walked straight into Rosa. "Excuse me," she said, still clutching her tray of empty glasses. Up close, she looked younger than I'd initially thought, maybe mid-30s, with tired eyes that had seen too many late nights and difficult customers. "That was quite a tip," I said, nodding toward the table where Jackie sat checking her phone. Rosa's face clouded. "Yeah, well, don't get too excited about it. Guys like that, they're usually compensating for something. Big tips, big talk, big problems. You've seen him before?" She glanced around nervously. "Look, I shouldn't be talking about customers, but that guy? He's been coming in here for months. Some nights he's throwing money around like he owns the place. Other nights, he's nursing one drink for 3 hours and asking if we validate parking." Before I could ask more questions, Rosa hurried away, leaving me with more questions than answers. But her words confirmed what my instincts were already telling me. Sterling Vance wasn't what he appeared to be. I made my way back to my hiding spot behind the slot machines just as Sterling returned to the table. He'd been gone longer than a simple restroom break would require, and I noticed him slipping his phone back into his pocket with the furtive gesture of someone who'd been making calls he didn't want overheard. "Everything okay?" Jackie asked, her voice carrying the kind of concern she used to reserve for me. "Just business," Sterling replied smoothly. "You know how it is." But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept scanning the casino floor like he was looking for someone he didn't want to find. Whatever business he'd been conducting, it hadn't gone well. Jackie didn't notice. She was too busy being charmed by his stories of high-stakes poker games and weekend trips to Atlantic City. She hung on every word like he was revealing the secrets of the universe, instead of just bragging about gambling wins that may or may not have actually happened. As the evening wore on, I watched my wife transform into someone I barely recognized. The practical woman who'd clipped coupons and budgeted our household expenses for over 2 decades was gone, replaced by someone who seemed intoxicated by the possibility of easy money and expensive thrills. Sterling ordered another round of drinks, paying with cash he peeled from a roll thick enough to choke a horse. But I noticed he counted the bills twice before handing them over, and his hand hesitated just long enough to suggest the gesture wasn't as casual as he wanted it to appear. "I should get going," Jackie said eventually, glancing at her watch. "Early morning tomorrow." "Of course," Sterling said, standing to help her with her coat. "But we should do this again soon. I know some places that make this look like amateur hour." Jackie's eyes lit up with the kind of excitement I hadn't seen in years. "I'd like that." They exchanged numbers with the practiced ease of people who'd been planning this moment for weeks. As Jackie gathered her purse and coat, I realized this wasn't their first meeting. This was just the first time I'd caught them together. I waited until Jackie left the casino before making my move. Sterling had returned to his seat at the bar, and without Jackie there to impress, his demeanor changed completely. The confident swagger disappeared, replaced by the hunched shoulders and nervous fidgeting of someone under pressure. He pulled out his phone and made another call, his voice low but urgent. I couldn't hear the words, but his body language told the story. He was arguing with someone, pleading, making promises he probably couldn't keep. When he hung up, Sterling sat staring at his drink for a long moment. Then he pulled out a small notebook and started scribbling numbers, crossing them out, scribbling again. Even from a distance, I could see the frustration in his movements. This was my chance. While Sterling was distracted with his calculations, I slipped outside to the parking lot. Jackie's car was already gone, but Sterling's was easy to spot, a flashy red convertible that screamed, "Look at me," from 3 rows away. I didn't plan to break into his car, I'm not that kind of guy. But as I walked past, I noticed something that made me stop. The passenger window was cracked open just enough for me to see papers scattered across the front seat. Late payment notices, past due bills, a letter from a collection agency with final notice stamped across the top in red ink. So much for Sterling Vance's image of success. The man who'd just tipped a waitress $1,000 couldn't pay his electric bill. I took photos with my phone, careful not to touch anything, before hurrying back to my own car. As I drove home through the empty streets, my mind raced with possibilities. Jackie thought she'd found her ticket to a better life, but she'd actually hitched her wagon to a sinking ship. The question was, what was I going to do about it? The next morning, Jackie was already gone when I woke up. Her coffee cup sat in the sink, lipstick stain on the rim like a signature. She'd left a note on the kitchen counter. Client meeting downtown, home late. Don't cook. Don't cook. Like I'd been planning to prepare some elaborate meal instead of heating up leftover pizza and watching television until she decided to grace me with her presence. I called in sick to work, first time in 3 years, and drove to Bob's garage. Bob Martinez had been my best friend since high school, back when we were both young enough to think we'd conquer the world with nothing but determination and bad jokes. Now we were both middle-aged men with mortgages and responsibilities, but Bob still had the same irreverent sense of humor that had gotten us through chemistry class and basic training. "You look like someone stole your lunch money," Bob said when I walked into his garage. He was elbow-deep in the engine of a 1967 Camaro, his coveralls stained with grease and coffee. "Worse. Someone's trying to steal my wife." Bob straightened up, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Come again?" I told him everything. The casino, Sterling Vance, the $1,000 tip, the bills in the car. Bob listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "So what's your plan?" he asked when I finished. "I don't have a plan. That's why I'm here." "Well, you've got 2 choices. You can confront Jackie directly and hope she comes to her senses, or you can dig deeper and find out exactly what kind of man she's getting involved with." "What would you do?" Bob grinned, but there was no humor in it. "I'd want to know exactly who I was dealing with before I made any moves. Knowledge is power, Warren. And right now, this Sterling character has all the advantages." He was right. Jackie was operating on emotion and fantasy, while Sterling was clearly running some kind of game. If I wanted to compete, I needed to understand the rules. How do we find out more about him? We start with the basics: full name, address, employment history. Then we see what kind of financial shape he's really in. Bob had connections I didn't. Guys who'd worked in security, others who'd done time in law enforcement before moving into private sector jobs. Within 2 hours, we had Sterling's full name, address, and enough background information to paint a disturbing picture. Sterling Michael Vance, age 42, currently unemployed. Previous jobs included car sales, real estate, and something vaguely described as investment consulting. His apartment was in a complex that advertised luxury living, but was actually a step above low-income housing with a fancy name. "This guy's a professional charmer," Bob said, scrolling through the information on his laptop. "Look at this pattern. He gets jobs that require him to build trust with clients, then something goes wrong and he moves on. Never anything criminal enough to get arrested for, but enough to suggest he's not exactly honest." The financial information was even more revealing. Sterling had maxed out 7 credit cards, defaulted on 2 car loans, and been evicted from his previous apartment for non-payment of rent. The flashy convertible was leased, and according to Bob's sources, he was 3 months behind on payments. "So where's he getting the money for $1,000 tips?" I asked. "Good question. Either he's got some income source that's not showing up on paper, or he's robbing Peter to pay Paul. My guess is the latter." We spent the rest of the afternoon building a complete financial profile of Sterling Vance. It wasn't pretty. The man was drowning in debt, living paycheck to paycheck when he had paychecks, and apparently funding his lifestyle by borrowing against future income that might never materialize. But he was smart about it. He knew how to present himself, how to dress for success, even when success was nowhere in sight. The expensive watch was probably fake, the Italian shoes were likely knockoffs, and the confident demeanor was pure theater. "He's a con man," Bob said finally. "Maybe not a criminal one, but definitely someone who makes a living by convincing people he's something he's not." And Jackie fell for it. Jackie fell for the fantasy. Can't really blame her for that. We all want to believe in fairy tales sometimes. But I could blame her, and I did. 23 years of marriage should have taught her something about the difference between substance and style. I'd never been flashy or exciting, but I'd been reliable. I'd paid the bills, maintained the house, and never once made her worry about whether the lights would stay on or the mortgage would get paid. Apparently, reliability wasn't enough anymore. That evening, I waited for Jackie to come home. She arrived just after 10, looking flushed and happy in a way that made my stomach turn. "How was your day?" she asked, as if she actually cared about the answer. "Fine. How was your client meeting?" "Oh, same old stuff. Personal injury case, lots of paperwork." She was lying, and we both knew it, but I wasn't ready to play that card yet. Instead, I watched her move around our kitchen, the one we'd remodeled together 5 years ago, like she was already somewhere else in her mind. "I might be working late again tomorrow," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Big case coming up." "Of course you will." She looked at me sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing, just that you've been working a lot of late nights lately." "It's called dedication, Warren. Some of us are trying to advance our careers." The implication stung because it was designed to. Jackie had always resented the fact that I was content with my job, that I didn't have grand ambitions or dreams of climbing corporate ladders. I liked engineering because it was logical, predictable, and useful. Buildings needed to stay up, bridges needed to bear weight, and systems needed to function reliably. But apparently, reliability was boring. After Jackie went to bed, I sat in my home office with Sterling's financial records spread across my desk like evidence in a criminal trial. The numbers told a clear story of someone living far beyond his means, funding today's expenses with tomorrow's problems. I started making copies of everything, organizing the information into a comprehensive file that documented Sterling's real financial situation. Bank statements showing overdraft fees, credit reports revealing maxed-out cards, collection notices demanding payment for everything from utilities to car loans. By 3 a.m, I had assembled a complete picture of Sterling Vance's finances, and it was uglier than I'd expected. The man wasn't just broke, he was catastrophically broke, the kind of broke that meant he was probably borrowing money from loan sharks or running up gambling debts he couldn't pay. Which raised an interesting question. Where had he gotten the money for that $1,000 tip? I spent the next day doing more research, calling in favors from colleagues who had connections in the financial industry. What I learned made my stomach turn. Sterling had been frequenting multiple casinos in the region, not just the one where I'd seen him with Jackie. He had a pattern of winning big on certain nights, then losing everything back over the following weeks, but the timing was suspicious. His big wins always seemed to coincide with new credit card applications or personal loans. It looked like Sterling was using borrowed money to gamble, hoping to win big enough to pay back his debts and fund his lifestyle. When he won, he lived like a king for a few days, throwing money around to impress people like Jackie. When he lost, he scrambled to find new sources of credit to keep the cycle going. It was a house of cards that was bound to collapse eventually. The only question was whether Jackie would be caught in the wreckage when it happened. That night, I made my decision. I couldn't compete with Sterling's flashy gestures or expensive gifts, but I could give Jackie something more valuable: the truth. I compiled all the financial information into a neat folder, along with photos of Sterling's overdue bills and a timeline showing his pattern of financial irresponsibility. Then I wrote a simple note. You deserve to know who you're really dealing with. The next morning, after Jackie left for work, I drove to her office and left the folder with the receptionist, asking her to deliver it to Jackie personally. No return address, no signature, just the facts laid out in black and white. Then I went home and waited for the storm to hit. Jackie didn't come home that night, or the next. Her absence filled our house like a presence, making every room feel too empty and too quiet. She'd taken clothes, toiletries, and the jewelry box her mother had given her for our 10th anniversary. The message was clear. This wasn't a temporary cooling-off period. On Thursday evening, she finally called. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "I'm listening. Not over the phone. Meet me at Murphy's in an hour." Murphy's was a dive bar 3 blocks from our house, the kind of place where the beer was cheap and the lighting was dim enough to hide whatever conversation you didn't want the world to overhear. I arrived early and claimed a corner booth, ordering a whiskey I didn't really want, and watching the door. Jackie walked in 20 minutes later, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wasn't wearing makeup. For a moment, she looked like the woman I'd married instead of the stranger she'd become. "You had no right," she said, sliding into the booth across from me. "No right to what? Give you information about the man you're having an affair with?" "I'm not having an affair." "What would you call it?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. "I call it finding someone who makes me feel alive again." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were honest. Somewhere along the way, our marriage had become a routine instead of a relationship, a series of habits and obligations that neither of us questioned. "And Sterling makes you feel alive?" He did. She looked up at me, and I saw something that might have been regret in her eyes. "Until I saw those papers you left for me. So you know the truth about his finances. I know he's not what he pretended to be, but neither are you, apparently." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I never knew you were the type of person who would spy on someone, steal their personal information, and use it to sabotage their relationships." She had a point, and we both knew it. The Warren Mercer who'd married Jackie 23 years ago would never have followed his wife to a casino or photographed another man's bills. But that Warren Mercer had also never imagined his wife would fall for a con artist's $1,000 gesture. "I was trying to protect you." From what? From making my own choices? From taking a chance on something exciting for once in my life? From being taken advantage of by someone who's using you? Jackie laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think I don't know that? You think I'm so naive that I couldn't figure out Sterling was in financial trouble?" The question caught me off guard. "You knew." "I suspected. But you know what, Warren? I didn't care. For the first time in 20 years, someone was treating me like I was worth something, like I was worth a $1,000 gesture, even if he couldn't afford it. He was performing for you, putting on a show. And what have you been doing for the past 20 years? Going through the motions, paying the bills and mowing the lawn and acting like that's enough to keep a marriage alive?" Her words stung because they contained enough truth to hurt. I had been going through the motions, assuming that reliability and consistency were enough. I'd forgotten that Jackie was a person with dreams and desires, not just a partner in the business of running a household. "So what happens now?" I asked. "I don't know. Sterling's been avoiding my calls since Tuesday. I think your little information packet scared him off." "Good. Is it good, Warren? Is it good that you destroyed something that made me happy, even if it wasn't perfect?" I wanted to tell her that Sterling would have destroyed it himself eventually, that his financial situation was unsustainable and his lifestyle was built on borrowed time. But looking at Jackie's face, I realized she already knew that. She'd chosen the fantasy anyway, and I'd taken it away from her. "I'm staying at my sister's for a while," she said, standing to leave. "I need time to think about what I want." "And us? Our marriage?" "I don't know if there's an us anymore, Warren. Maybe there hasn't been for a long time." She left me sitting in the booth with an untouched whiskey and 23 years of assumptions crumbling around me. I'd won the battle. Sterling was out of the picture, but it felt like I'd lost something much more important in the process. The next few days passed in a blur of empty rooms and unanswered questions. I went to work, came home, and tried to figure out how my life had fallen apart so quickly. Bob stopped by with pizza and beer, but even his usual jokes couldn't lift the weight that had settled over everything. "You did the right thing," he said, settling into my kitchen chair like he belonged there. Sterling was bad news. Jackie doesn't see it that way. Jackie's hurt and embarrassed. Give her time to process everything. What if she decides she wants a divorce? Bob was quiet for a moment, peeling the label off his beer bottle. Then you deal with it. But don't assume that's where this is heading. 23 years is a lot of history to throw away over some smooth-talking gambler. But as the days turned into a week, then 2 weeks, I started to wonder if history was enough. Jackie had moved more of her things out of the house, and our conversations had dwindled to brief text messages about practical matters. She was building a life that didn't include me, and I was learning to live in a house that felt more like a museum of our marriage than a home. Then, on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks after our conversation at Murphy's, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Jackie's number, and for a moment I felt something that might have been hope. "Warren, I need to ask you something." "Okay." "Did you do anything else? Besides the financial information, I mean. Did you contact Sterling directly, or interfere with his life in any other way?" The question puzzled me. "No." "Why?" "Because something's happened to him. Something bad." She told me the story in fragments, her voice shaking with emotion. Sterling had been arrested 2 days earlier on charges of check fraud and identity theft. Apparently, his financial desperation had driven him to crimes more serious than just living beyond his means. "The police think he's been running scams for months," Jackie said. "Fake checks, stolen credit card numbers, forged documents. They found evidence in his apartment linking him to at least a dozen victims." I felt a mixture of vindication and sympathy. Vindication because it proved my instincts about Sterling had been right. Sympathy because I could hear the pain in Jackie's voice as she realized how thoroughly she'd been deceived. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "Are you?" "Because part of me wonders if you knew this would happen, if you planned it somehow." "Jackie, I'm an engineer, not a detective. I found out about his debts and shared that information with you. That's all." "But you started something, Warren. Your interference set off a chain reaction that led to this." She was probably right. My investigation had likely spooked Sterling, made him desperate enough to take risks that ultimately led to his arrest. But I couldn't feel guilty about exposing a con artist, even if the consequences had been more severe than I'd intended. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now I have to figure out how to rebuild my life. Again. Does that include us?" Jackie was quiet for so long I thought she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know, Warren. I really don't know." The line went quiet, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the growing realization that winning this battle might have cost me the war. Sterling was gone, but so was Jackie's trust in me. And without trust, I wasn't sure what was left to rebuild. 2 months after Sterling's arrest, I was still living alone in a house that felt too big and too quiet. Jackie had filed for separation, not divorce yet, but the legal equivalent of putting our marriage on life support. She was renting a small apartment across town and had started therapy, trying to make sense of how her life had derailed so completely. I probably should have been in therapy too, but instead, I threw myself into work and spent my evenings researching Sterling's case. The local newspaper had covered his arrest with the kind of salacious detail that sells papers. Local man arrested in multi-state fraud scheme. Casino con artist bilked dozens of victims. Reading the articles, I learned details about Sterling that made my own investigation look amateur. He'd been running romance scams online, targeting lonely women and convincing them to send money for fake emergencies. He'd stolen identities to open credit accounts, then maxed them out before disappearing. The $1,000 tip that had impressed Jackie so much had probably been stolen from one of his victims. But what bothered me wasn't Sterling's crimes. It was the way Jackie still talked about him during our occasional phone conversations. Even knowing what he'd done, she seemed to blame me more than him for the destruction of her fantasy. "You couldn't just let me be happy," she'd said during our last conversation. "You had to dig and pry and ruin everything. I was trying to protect you from a criminal. You were trying to control me. There's a difference." Maybe she was right. Maybe my motives hadn't been as pure as I'd told myself. But sitting alone in my kitchen on a Friday night, eating takeout Chinese food and reading about Sterling's latest court appearance, I realized I didn't care about my motives anymore. I cared about results. Sterling had made a fool of my wife, destroyed my marriage, and apparently ruined the lives of dozens of other people. The legal system would handle his crimes, but that didn't address the personal damage he'd caused. And it definitely didn't address the fact that Jackie still seemed to think I was the villain in this story. That's when I decided to take a more active approach to Sterling's punishment. The idea came to me while reading about his upcoming bail hearing. According to the newspaper, Sterling's lawyer was arguing that his client posed no flight risk and should be released pending trial. The prosecutor disagreed, citing Sterling's history of deception and the serious nature of the charges. I knew which side I was rooting for, but I also knew that legal arguments might not be enough. Judges made decisions based on evidence and precedent, not on the personal damage defendants caused to marriages and families. So I decided to provide some additional evidence. Sterling's case had been assigned to Judge Patricia Hawkins, a woman known for her no-nonsense approach to white-collar crime. Through some careful research, the kind of background checking I'd learned during my investigation of Sterling, I discovered that Judge Hawkins had a particular interest in cases involving crimes against the elderly. Sterling's victim list included several senior citizens who'd lost their retirement savings to his romance scams. But the prosecutor's office was focused on the more recent financial crimes, not the earlier victims who might be harder to track down and interview. I spent the next 2 weeks finding those earlier victims. It wasn't easy. Sterling had been careful to target people who were isolated and unlikely to report being scammed. But he'd also been sloppy in some ways, leaving digital trails that someone with patience and technical skills could follow. I found Margaret Chen, an 83-year-old widow who'd sent Sterling $15,000 for a fake medical emergency. I found Robert Thompson, a retired teacher who'd been convinced to invest in Sterling's non-existent real estate ventures. I found Patricia Williams, whose late husband's life insurance money had disappeared into Sterling's gambling debts. Each story was heartbreaking in its own way, but they were also powerful evidence of Sterling's pattern of targeting vulnerable people. And unlike the financial crimes that had led to his arrest, these cases showed a level of cruelty that went beyond simple greed. I compiled everything into a comprehensive report, complete with documentation, victim statements, and a timeline showing Sterling's escalating criminal behavior. Then I sent copies to the prosecutor's office, the judge's clerk, and the local newspaper reporter who'd been covering the case. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Sterling's bail hearing was postponed while the prosecutor's office investigated the new evidence. The newspaper ran a front-page story about the additional victims, complete with photos and interviews that painted Sterling as a predator who targeted the most vulnerable members of society. But the most satisfying result was Jackie's phone call the day after the story ran. "Did you do this?" she asked without preamble. "Do what?" "Don't play dumb, Warren. The newspaper story about Sterling's other victims, the additional evidence that showed up at the prosecutor's office. Did you track down those people?" "I did some research, yes." "Why? He's already been arrested. Why couldn't you just let it go?" "Because he hurt people, Jackie. A lot of people. And someone needed to make sure the whole truth came out." She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, smaller, more uncertain. "Some of those people lost everything. Their life savings, their homes. That elderly woman, Margaret Chen, She's living with her daughter now because she can't afford her apartment anymore. I know. And you think Sterling did that while he was taking me to dinner and impressing me with expensive gestures? I think Sterling was using stolen money to fund his lifestyle, and that lifestyle included impressing you. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications. I could almost hear Jackie processing the reality of what Sterling had been doing while she was falling for his act. I feel sick, she said finally. You should. But you should also feel grateful that you found out before he took you for everything you had. Is that what you think would have happened? I think Sterling was escalating. The financial crimes, the romance scams, the identity theft, it was all getting more serious, more desperate. If I hadn't exposed him when I did, you might have been his next victim instead of just his next mark. Another long silence. Then, I need to think about this. About everything. She hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me with the satisfaction of knowing I'd finally made her understand what Sterling really was. But satisfaction felt hollow when it came at the cost of everything I'd built with the woman I loved. Over the next few weeks, Sterling's case continued to make headlines as more victims came forward. His bail was denied, and his lawyer started making noises about a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial. The man who'd destroyed my marriage with a $1,000 gesture was facing decades in prison. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt empty. Sterling was getting what he deserved, but Jackie was still living across town, still processing the wreckage of her shattered illusions, still unsure whether she could forgive me for being right about everything. The house remained too quiet, the evenings too long, and the future too uncertain. I'd won my war against Sterling Vance, but I wasn't sure what victory was worth if it cost me everything that mattered. Spring arrived with the kind of weather that makes you believe in second chances. The trees in our neighborhood, my neighborhood now I supposed, were budding with new leaves, and the air carried the promise of warmer days ahead. But inside my house, winter seemed to have taken up permanent residence. Jackie and I had been separated for 4 months, and our conversations had dwindled to brief exchanges about practical matters. She'd taken most of her belongings, leaving behind only the furniture we'd bought together and the accumulated debris of a 23-year marriage. Sterling's trial had been scheduled for late summer, and according to the newspaper coverage, he was facing serious prison time. The additional victims I'd helped identify had strengthened the prosecutor's case considerably, and Sterling's lawyer was reportedly pushing hard for a plea bargain. I should have felt satisfied with how everything had turned out. Sterling was going to prison, Jackie was safe from his schemes, and justice was being served. But satisfaction is hard to achieve when you're eating dinner alone every night and sleeping in a bed that feels too big for one person. That's when Rosa Delmont called. I remembered Rosa from that night at the casino, the cocktail waitress who'd received Sterling's $1,000 tip and later warned me that he was probably compensating for something. I hadn't thought about her in months, but apparently she'd been thinking about me. Mr. Mercer? This is Rosa from the Riverside Casino. We met briefly a few months ago. I remember. How did you get my number? It's a long story, but I need to talk to you about Sterling Vance. Can we meet somewhere? We arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where we could talk without drawing attention. Rosa arrived looking nervous, glancing around the cafe like she expected Sterling to materialize from behind the espresso machine. I've been following his case in the newspapers, she said after we'd ordered coffee. All those people he hurt, all that money he stole. I keep thinking about that night when he tipped me $1,000. What about it? I should have known it was too good to be true. Nobody tips a cocktail waitress that much unless they're trying to prove something or impress someone. He was definitely trying to impress my wife. Rosa nodded, stirring her coffee absently. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. Your wife, I mean. I think Sterling was planning something bigger than just an affair. The words sent a chill through me. What do you mean? After you left that night, I kept watching them. Sterling was asking your wife a lot of questions about her job, about your finances, about your assets. It felt like an interview, not a seduction. I thought about Jackie's job at the law firm, her access to client information and legal documents. I thought about our house, our savings account, the life insurance policies we'd taken out years ago. In the wrong hands, that information could be valuable. You think he was planning to scam her? I think he was planning to scam both of you. Your wife for immediate access to money and information, and you as the long-term target. Rich husband, trusting wife, access to legal documents, it's a con artist's dream scenario. The implications made my stomach turn. While I'd been worried about Jackie having an affair, Sterling had apparently been planning something much more devastating. If Rosa was right, Jackie hadn't just been a victim of romantic manipulation, she'd been selected as an unwitting accomplice in a scheme to destroy our lives. Why are you telling me this now? Rosa looked uncomfortable. Because I found something in Sterling's car the night he was arrested. Something the police didn't find because I got to it first. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook, the kind used for taking orders in restaurants. But instead of food orders, the pages were filled with notes about Jackie and me. Our address, our cars, our work schedules, even details about our neighbors and friends. He was watching you, Rosa said. Both of you. This notebook has weeks of surveillance notes, like he was planning some kind of operation. I flipped through the pages, feeling increasingly sick as I read Sterling's observations. He'd noted when Jackie left for work, when I came home, when our house was empty. He'd recorded the make and model of our cars, our license plate numbers, even the name of our insurance company. On the last page, he'd written a timeline. Phase 1, establish relationship with target. Phase 2, gain access to financial information. Phase 3, execute transfer protocols. Transfer protocols? I think he was planning to steal your identity, Rosa said. Use your wife's access to legal documents to forge papers that would give him access to your accounts. The notebook contained enough information to ruin us financially and legally. If Sterling had succeeded in his plan, Jackie and I might have lost everything, our house, our savings, possibly even our freedom if we'd been implicated in his crimes. Why didn't you give this to the police? Rosa looked away. Because I was involved with Sterling too. Before your wife, I mean. He was working the same scam on me, asking questions about my finances, my family. I was stupid enough to give him some information before I figured out what he was doing. What kind of information? Bank account numbers, social security information, details about my elderly mother's finances. Nothing he could use immediately, but enough to cause problems if it got into the wrong hands. Rosa had been another target, another woman selected for what she could provide rather than who she was. The realization that Sterling had been running multiple cons simultaneously made his arrest seem even more fortunate. We need to give this to the prosecutor, I said. I know, but I wanted you to see it first, because I think your wife should know how close she came to being destroyed. Rosa was right. Jackie needed to understand that her involvement with Sterling hadn't been a romantic mistake. It had been recruitment into a criminal enterprise. She'd been selected, cultivated, and manipulated not because Sterling found her attractive, but because she had access to the tools he needed to commit larger crimes. That evening, I called Jackie and asked her to meet me. Not at Murphy's this time, but at our house. The house we'd bought together, decorated together, and filled with 2 decades of shared memories. She arrived, looking wary, like she expected another confrontation about her choices or my interference. Instead, I handed her Rosa's notebook and watched her face change as she read Sterling's notes. He was watching us, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He was planning to rob us, maybe frame us for crimes we didn't commit. You weren't his girlfriend, Jackie. You were his mark. She read through the notebook twice, her hands shaking as the implications became clear. Sterling's romantic pursuit had been a business transaction, a calculated effort to gain access to our lives and assets. "I feel so stupid," she said finally. "You're not stupid. You're human." Sterling was a professional manipulator who made a living by exploiting people's desires and vulnerabilities. But I should have seen through it. I should have realized that someone like him wouldn't be interested in someone like me unless he wanted something. The self-deprecation in her voice broke my heart. Jackie was an attractive, intelligent woman who deserved to be pursued for who she was, not what she could provide. Sterling's manipulation had damaged more than just our marriage. It had damaged her sense of self-worth. "Sterling targeted you because you're smart and capable and have access to legal resources," I said. "He saw you as valuable, just not in the way you thought." We sat in our living room, surrounded by the artifacts of our marriage, and talked more honestly than we had in years. Jackie told me about her loneliness, her feeling that our marriage had become routine and predictable. I told her about my fear of losing her, my clumsy attempts to protect her from a threat I didn't fully understand. "I'm sorry," she said as the evening wound down. "For everything. For falling for Sterling's act, for blaming you when you were trying to help, for nearly destroying our marriage over a fantasy. I'm sorry, too, for not paying attention to what you needed, for investigating Sterling without talking to you first, for being so focused on being right that I forgot about being understanding." We didn't solve everything that night. 23 years of marriage and 4 months of separation couldn't be repaired with a single conversation. But we made a start, and for the first time since that night at the casino, I felt like we might have a future together. Rosa's notebook became a key piece of evidence in Sterling's case, demonstrating the scope and sophistication of his criminal enterprise. His lawyer abandoned any pretense of innocence and negotiated a plea bargain that would send Sterling to prison for 12 to 15 years. Jackie moved back home on a warm Saturday in May, bringing her clothes and her jewelry box and a cautious optimism about our chances of rebuilding what we'd nearly lost. We started couples therapy, began talking about our problems instead of avoiding them, and slowly learned to trust each other again. Sterling Vance was sentenced on a Tuesday in June to 14 years in federal prison. Jackie and I didn't attend the hearing, but we read about it in the newspaper over coffee in our kitchen, surrounded by the ordinary details of a life we'd almost thrown away. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't followed me that night?" Jackie asked. "Every day, but I try not to dwell on it. I think he would have destroyed us, our marriage, our finances, maybe even our freedom." She was probably right. Sterling's plan had been sophisticated and thorough, designed to exploit every vulnerability in our relationship and our circumstances. If I hadn't stumbled across his financial problems and started investigating, we might have lost everything without ever understanding what had happened to us. Instead, we'd lost only time and trust, precious things, but recoverable ones. Our marriage was different now, more honest and more fragile, but also more intentional. We'd learned not to take each other for granted, not to assume that routine and reliability were sufficient foundations for a life together. Sterling's $1,000 tip had been the beginning of the end of his criminal career and the beginning of a new chapter in our marriage. Sometimes the most destructive gestures lead to the most important discoveries, and sometimes you have to nearly lose everything to understand what you actually have. 1 year after Sterling's sentencing, I thought our story was over. Jackie and I had rebuilt our marriage on a foundation of hard-won honesty and mutual respect. We'd sold the house, too many bad memories, and bought a smaller place across town where we could start fresh. Jackie had found a new job at a different law firm, and I'd been promoted to senior engineer at my company. Life was good. Quiet, predictable, and good. Then Sterling escaped from federal prison. The news broke on a Tuesday morning while Jackie and I were having coffee and reading the paper like any other suburban couple. The headline jumped off the page: "Convicted fraudster escapes during prison transport." Sterling had been en route to a medical appointment when the transport van had been involved in what appeared to be a staged accident. 2 guards were injured but alive, and Sterling had vanished along with another prisoner. The FBI was coordinating the manhunt, but so far there were no solid leads. "He wouldn't come after us, would he?" Jackie asked, her face pale as she read the article. "I don't know, but we're not taking any chances." I called the local police and the FBI field office, informing them about our history with Sterling and requesting additional patrols in our neighborhood. The agents I spoke with were professional but not particularly reassuring. Sterling was considered dangerous, and anyone who'd been involved in his case should take precautions. For 3 days, nothing happened. Jackie and I went to work, came home, and tried to maintain our normal routines while looking over our shoulders. The FBI released Sterling's photo to the media, and his face appeared on every news broadcast and wanted poster in the region. On Friday evening, Rosa called. "He contacted me," she said without preamble. "Sterling. He called my apartment an hour ago." My stomach dropped. "What did he say?" "He wanted to know where you and Jackie were living now. He said he had some unfinished business to take care of." "Did you tell him anything?" "Of course not. But Warren, he sounded different. Angry in a way I've never heard before. Prison changed him." I thanked Rosa and immediately called the FBI. They traced the call, but Sterling had used a burner phone and was already gone by the time agents reached the location. However, the call confirmed what we'd all suspected. Sterling was in the area, and he was looking for us. That night, Jackie and I barely slept. Every sound outside our bedroom window might have been Sterling. Every shadow in the backyard might have been a threat. We'd installed a security system after moving into the new house, but it felt inadequate against someone who'd spent a year in prison, learning from more experienced criminals. Saturday passed without incident, but the tension was wearing on both of us. Jackie jumped at every phone ring, and I found myself checking the locks compulsively. We were prisoners in our own home, held captive by the specter of a man we'd thought was safely behind bars. Sunday evening, Sterling made his move. I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when the power went out. Not just in our house, but throughout the entire neighborhood, a coordinated blackout that could only have been sabotage. "Warren?" Jackie's voice came from the living room, tight with fear. "Stay where you are. Don't move." I grabbed the flashlight we kept in the kitchen drawer and made my way toward Jackie's voice. Outside, I could hear our neighbors calling to each other, confused by the sudden darkness. But I knew this wasn't a random power failure. The front doorbell rang. Jackie and I froze, staring at each other in the flashlight's beam. Nobody made social calls during neighborhood blackouts, and certainly not at 9 o'clock on a Sunday night. The bell rang again, followed by a voice I recognized from that night at the casino. "Warren? Jackie? I know you're in there. We need to talk." Sterling's voice was different, harder, more controlled than the smooth charm I remembered. Prison had stripped away his pretenses, leaving something more dangerous underneath. "I'm calling the police," Jackie whispered. She pulled out her phone, but there was no signal. Sterling had thought of everything. "The phone lines are down too," Sterling called through the door, as if he'd heard our conversation. "Cell towers are being jammed. It's just us, the way it should have been a year ago." I moved to the window and peered through the curtains. Sterling was standing on our front porch, but he wasn't alone. 2 other men flanked him, his fellow escapees, I assumed. All 3 were wearing dark clothing and appeared to be armed. "What do you want?" I called through the door. "I want what you took from me. My freedom, my reputation, my future. You destroyed my life, Warren. Now I'm going to return the favor." "You destroyed your own life by being a criminal." Sterling laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I was making a living, providing a service to people who wanted to believe in something better than their ordinary lives. Your wife understood that. She appreciated what I was offering. You were stealing from people, elderly people, vulnerable people. I was giving them hope. dreams, excitement. What were you giving them? What were you giving Jackie? Stability? Reliability? How boring. The conversation was surreal, a philosophical debate conducted through a locked door while armed men waited outside. But I could hear the genuine anger in Sterling's voice, the resentment that had been building during his year in prison. "Let Jackie go," I said. "Your problem is with me. My problem is with both of you." Jackie testified against me at the sentencing hearing. She told the judge how grateful she was that I'd been caught before I could hurt more people. Very touching testimony. I'd forgotten about Jackie's victim impact statement, the letter she'd written describing how Sterling's manipulation had affected our marriage and our lives. At the time, it had felt like closure. Now it felt like a target painted on our backs. "What do you want us to do?" "Open the door. Let us in. We're going to have a conversation about consequences." I looked at Jackie, who was standing in the hallway with tears streaming down her face. She'd been through enough because of Sterling Vance. We both had. "No," I said. "I'm sorry?" I said no. "You want to have a conversation about consequences? Here's one. If you don't leave our property immediately, you're going to face the consequences of breaking into the home of someone who's prepared to defend it." I opened the hall closet and pulled out the shotgun I'd bought after Sterling's first arrest, a precaution I'd hoped never to need. Jackie's eyes widened, but she didn't protest. "You're not a fighter, Warren," Sterling called. "You're an engineer, a problem solver. Let's solve this problem together." "The problem is already solved. You're going back to prison, and this time, you're not getting out." I heard Sterling talking to his companions, their voices too low to make out the words. Then footsteps moving around the house, checking windows and looking for alternate entrances. "They're trying to get in the back," Jackie whispered. I handed her the flashlight and moved toward the rear of the house. Through the kitchen window, I could see one of Sterling's companions trying to force the sliding door that led to our patio. The security system was useless without power, but the reinforced locks I'd installed were holding. That's when I heard the sound of breaking glass from the front of the house. Sterling had smashed the window next to our front door and was reaching through to unlock the deadbolt. In 30 seconds, he'd be inside our home with 2 armed accomplices and nothing but darkness to hide in. I made a decision that the old Warren Mercer never would have made. I walked to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped outside onto the porch with the shotgun in my hands. Sterling was still reaching through the broken window when he saw me. His face registered surprise, then something that might have been respect. "Now that's more like it," he said, straightening up and brushing glass from his sleeve. "I was beginning to think prison had made me soft, but you're still the same careful, methodical man who destroyed my life. You destroyed your own life. I just documented it." Semantics. The result was the same. Sterling's companions had moved closer, flanking him on either side of the porch. In the darkness, I couldn't see their faces clearly, but their body language suggested they were waiting for Sterling's signal to act. "Here's what's going to happen," Sterling said. "You're going to put down that gun, invite us inside, and we're going to have a civilized conversation about how you're going to make amends for what you did to me. And if I refuse? Then things get uncivilized very quickly." I'd never pointed a weapon at another human being before, never imagined I'd be capable of violence even in self-defense. But standing on my front porch in the darkness, facing a man who'd already destroyed my marriage once and was now threatening to destroy my life, I discovered reserves of determination I didn't know I possessed. "Sterling," I said quietly, "you have 10 seconds to get off my property before I start shooting." "You won't do it. You're not that kind of person, Warren. You're a suburban engineer who pays his taxes and follows the rules." "Maybe. But I'm also a man who's tired of letting criminals make decisions for him." I raised the shotgun to my shoulder, aiming at Sterling's chest. The movement was awkward. I'd only fired the weapon a few times at a shooting range. But the message was clear. Sterling's companions shifted nervously, their hands moving toward whatever weapons they were carrying. but Sterling held up a hand, stopping them. "Interesting," he said. "Prison really did change me, but apparently marriage counseling changed you too." 5 seconds. "All right, Warren, you win this round. But this isn't over. I know where you work, where Jackie works, where you shop and eat and live your boring little lives. I can wait." "No, you can't. Because you're going back to prison tonight." As if summoned by my words, police sirens began wailing in the distance. Sterling's face changed as he realized what was happening. "You called them before the power went out," he said. "I called them the moment Rosa told me you'd contacted her. They've been watching the house for 3 days, waiting for you to make your move." The sirens were getting closer, and Sterling's companions were getting nervous. One of them grabbed Sterling's arm, urging him to run, but Sterling shook him off. "You think this is over?" he asked me. "I think you're going to spend the rest of your life in a maximum security prison, probably in solitary confinement. I think you'll have plenty of time to think about the choices that brought you here." Police cars rounded the corner at the end of our street, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Sterling looked at them, then back at me, his face a mask of rage and defeat. "Enjoy your victory, Warren. Enjoy your quiet life and your reconciled marriage and your suburban safety. But remember, there are always more Sterling Vances out there, and they're always looking for people like Jackie." He turned and ran into the darkness, his companions following. But the police were ready for them, and the chase lasted less than 2 minutes. By the time the power came back on, Sterling and his accomplices were in custody, and our neighborhood was safe again. Jackie and I spent the rest of the night giving statements to FBI agents and local detectives. By morning, Sterling was back in federal custody, this time in a maximum security facility where escape would be impossible. The newspapers called it the end of the Sterling Vance saga, but for Jackie and me, it felt more like a beginning. We'd faced our worst fears together and emerged stronger than before. Our marriage had been tested by deception, betrayal, separation, and violence, and it had survived. Sterling was sentenced to an additional 20 years for the escape and home invasion charges. He would be eligible for parole when he was 73 years old, assuming he lived that long in maximum security. Jackie and I never spoke about that night in detail, but we didn't need to. We'd learned that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when they're protecting what matters most to them. We'd learned that trust, once broken, can be rebuilt stronger than before. And we'd learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not in courtrooms or casinos, but on your own front porch in the darkness. Our story didn't end with Sterling's final capture. It continued with quiet mornings over coffee, with honest conversations about our hopes and fears, with the daily choice to build something together rather than drift apart. It continued with the knowledge that we'd faced the worst and survived, and that whatever challenges lay ahead, we'd face them together. Sterling Vance had tried to destroy us with a $1,000 gesture and a year of manipulation. In the end, he'd only made us stronger.